Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad that you've joined us for this seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Bill Hoyt, who has traveled across the country to be with us in these couple of days. Bill is an experienced lead pastor. He is an experienced regional overseer, similar to our role of district superintendent, but in the movement currently known as Converge. He has more than 20 years of experience as an adjunct professor in seminary, over 20 years of experience with his own coaching and consulting company. I first met Bill in 2011 when I was serving at an Alliance church that on the church health life cycle that looks like this, our church was in that last quarter that we call the descent to death. And Bill and a team came in and did an assessment at our church, made some prescriptions for us, and began to walk us through those prescriptions. And I am delighted to tell you that these many years later, by God's grace, that church has created a new iteration of the life cycle and is getting ready to plant a second campus. Over the last year, I reached out to Bill and was able to work with him to he offered 2 leading change coaching cohorts. He is also connected with a number of other lead pastors in our district for individual coaching. So far, about 15 of our lead pastors have benefited from Bill's experience and wisdom. And so I am delighted that he is here today to talk through some of those principles he covered in the Leading Change cohort. Keep in mind, Bill will be offering a new cohort, new topic in early January 2026. Well, January, February, we're nailing it down. Early 2026 on the topic of vision alignment. If you want to know more about that cohort, how to apply, what that's going to be about, all those parameters, then in your app, you can indicate that on that interest form of one of the things that you'd like more information about. So I just want to briefly pray for Bill and then turn it right on over to him. So Father, thank you for your servant, Bill. Thank you that you found him and you drew him into your family and drew him into service with you. Thank you for his life, for his story, and for the many, many times he has said yes to you, for the way that you've shaped him over the years through so many encounters and experiences to be such a valuable tool in the expansion of your kingdom. Thank you for his yes to being here today. We know that that was not a convenient yes, but we pray that you bless him for it. And now, Holy Spirit, would you just settle down on him and on us and use this time to speak to us about your bride, the church. And may we have ears to hear what you're saying. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, Bill.
Well, I'd like to thank Kelvin and Jen for inviting me to come and extending this privilege to me to be able to be here with you today. I've been to many of these kinds of events over the years, and I have to say this one in many respects is so different from any that I've seen before, and all in a better way. So I want to affirm that. More than just the privilege of being here and being able to do this, I'm grateful also for the privilege and the experience that's been mine to sit among you during worship. Thank you for allowing a Presbyterian to sit among you. And unless you are a repentant Presbyterian who has found his way to the Alliance, you probably don't understand the significance of that. But last night, or yesterday actually, on a couple of occasions, the dynamic of worship that was happening here was so powerful and so meaningful to me. I actually videoed some of it, and I sent it to the worship pastor at my home church. And I suggested that maybe we could do it a little more of this. And he texted me back, and he said there would need to be a preemptive 911 call. And the instruction would be to send multiple ambulances and maybe even a hearse or 2. Now, you know, really radical Presbyterians will raise their hands too. But we get them to about here, and that's it. And so I had them up here quite frequently in the worship time, and I'm grateful for that. I know nobody was looking at me during the worship, but if you had been looking at me during the worship, even at the times when everybody else in the room was clapping, you would have noticed that I was not clapping. And that's not because I'm a Presbyterian. It's because of who I am. When I went to Wheaton College, God led me into ministry on the south side of Chicago. Initially working to have Bible studies in the tenements, and then working to reach young people in the gangs on the south side of Chicago. And very early in my experience there, as a sociology major, I'm talking to one of my professors, and he looks at me and he says, "Hoyt, if you're going to have any effectiveness at all in working in the south side of Chicago," he said, "you need to understand the culture, and to understand the culture," white boy from Connecticut, small town, "if you're going to understand the culture, you need to understand the church, the black church." So for almost the entire time that I was at Wheaton, I attended First Church of Deliverance on the south side of Chicago. Preacher Cobbs was the preacher. At the time, it was the largest African-American church in the city. And because I kept showing up and I was white, after a while, they wanted me to sit down in the very front row with Preacher Cobbs and the deacons. I'll never forget the Sunday when the service was over and Preacher Cobbs comes wandering over to me, and he looks at me and he says, "Brother Bill, the deacons and I have met, and we have decided to exempt you from clapping." Now, if you didn't get that, have you seen the movie The Jerk? Yeah, okay. That scene in The Jerk, I was the inspiration for it. As a matter of fact, I auditioned for it. Steve Martin got the part on the condition that I would teach him and mentor him in how not to clap. So that's kind of what was going on there. Seriously, though, it really has been a delight to be among you, with you, and worshiping together with you. I want to talk about some of the things that I've learned about change and conflict in the 50-plus years that I've been in ministry. Oh, and I have a little issue here that I need to try and take care of. There we go. First thing I want to affirm is that effective change agents know people. They know how people think. They know how people react. They know how people process things. They know how people interact, and they understand why people behave the way they behave. And so the reality is that a change agent's EQ is actually more important than their IQ. And while I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, maybe in the Q&A time you might want to follow up on it a little bit. While I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, it is important for us to understand that the better we are able to read people, the better we are able to understand their reactions and their responses, the better we are able to connect relationally with people, the more effective we are going to be in change agentry. So what I'd like to do now is to share with you 13 insights that increase your chances of leading change and living to tell about it. First of all, people aren't opposed to change. They're opposed to change they didn't think of. Stop and think about it a second. Have you ever heard anybody argue against an idea that they had? No, they argue against the ideas that you had. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, the problem is that since everyone favors their own ideas, and most suggestions for change in a church come from ideas driven and generated by the leader, the pastor, or the leadership team, sometimes the pastor and the staff, and sometimes the pastor and lay leaders. But the advance of change, the encouragement, the introduction of change in a church comes typically from the top down, and everybody sitting there has their own idea of what changes they would like to see made. So, is there a better way? Is there a better way to deal with this issue? And that is, it's better to float ideas and initiatives than to sell them. See, kind of our natural tendency as humans is that we've got this idea. We want to convince you that this is a great way to go, and that's exactly what we try to do. We try to convince you. We try to sell you on the idea. We try to make you understand why this is so good. And recognizing that even people who love change have a limited capacity for change, and understanding that virtually everybody's first response to a change suggestion is no, it's better to float an idea. Just kind of lay it out there, plant a seed. Let it kind of germinate. Let it begin to catch on. And one of the best things that can happen when you're leading for change is that 6 or 8 months ago, you began talking about something, and periodically you've kind of just talked about it briefly, just kind of thrown it out in a discussion. And now, 6 or 8 months later, somebody in the meeting goes, I have a great idea. And it's wise at that point not to say, well, that was my idea. It's just good to say, you know, that is really interesting. Talk a little bit more about what you're thinking and get the discussion going. You know, there's that saying that, there's no limit to what can be accomplished if you don't care about who gets the credit. And that's when this is an instance where that's operative. You don't have to make the point that it was your idea in the first place. It's better yet to let them think it was their idea. And one of the reasons that this is so effective is that great ideas eventually resonate with people, even if they're initially met with resistance. If it's a really good idea, people begin to rethink it, people begin to reflect on it, and people begin to understand, oh, maybe this is a good idea, and maybe we really should do it. Good ideas often becomes great through the process. Over the years, some of the best ideas I've ever had started as a kernel. And maybe I kind of had a vision of how I thought it might play out and how it would grow. But the best ideas that I've ever had started that way, but in the process of other people with other experiences, other gifting, other personalities, reflecting on it, contributing to the discussion of it, and the idea that I had is suddenly an idea far superior to what I thought of originally. Bad ideas, on the other hand, seldom survive an open, honest, and vigorous process. And so a lot of times we can save ourselves from a misstep, maybe even a huge misstep, by entering into a process, starting it by seeding the idea long in advance. The second thing that I've learned is that people crave what they already like. Who doesn't like pasta? You know, we love the things that we already have experienced and that we like. You've never craved a food that you hadn't tasted. My wife has a cousin who lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he is thoroughly a southern redneck. And when we went to visit him, he decided, one of the questions that he asked when we first got there is, have you ever had alligator? And I said, no. And he said, good, we'll have alligator. And so he fixed alligator for us. Now, I'll tell you that before that experience, I had never craved alligator. I also want to report that after having eaten alligator, I still don't crave it, you know. The other reality is that sometimes we taste food, we've tried it, and we just don't like it. And that's a reality as well for some of the people when we begin to talk about change. Now, here's how it applies to change agentry. What is what most people already like. What is? It's familiar, it's comfortable. And so that's what they like. Otherwise, if that were not true, what is would already have been replaced by a what would be a what was having been replaced by another preferred what is. Always, you're dealing with a starting point of people being prejudiced toward what is. So people crave what they already like. And since that's true, and they like what is, now we begin to see why vision is so crucial. If you're going to lead for change, you need to paint a clear enough picture that people begin to crave a future they've never yet tasted. And if you don't do that, it will be exceedingly difficult, if not, in fact, in the long run, impossible to convince them to change. The third lesson is that most disagreement about change relates to strategy. It's relatively easy to agree on a preferred future. Who's not for more? Who's not for bigger? Who's not for better? We can agree that there is a preferred future out there. However, it becomes more difficult to agree on what the more, bigger, and better is. As soon as you start talking about making a change and it's going to be better, the minute you start talking in specifics about what that change might be, now you have discussion and potentially disagreement. It's even more difficult to agree upon how to achieve the more, the bigger, and the better. So even if you get to the place where you have, they've bought into the idea that we need to make a change, and they've even come to basically agree that this is the change we need to make, you're going to encounter more resistance and more difficulty when you start talking about how do we go about achieving that preferred future. So let's talk then about how to put strategy into its proper place. The problem for many, maybe even most of us, when we're trying to make changes, we begin with strategy. We begin talking about how we're going to do it. And most people start and end with strategy. And if we do that, again, the change is going to be hard, if at all effective. See, effective leaders start with mission and vision, not strategy. It starts with mission and vision. Now, starting with the mission and vision sets the stage for alignment, aligning all of our strategies, people resources, money, space, with the mission and the vision. So you start then with the end in sight. If people can see where we're headed, then when you begin to get to the discussion about how we're going to get there, the focus on the end result brings the discussion together, where you start with the many and begin to weed them down, begin to merge them, until you get to the place where there is a significant amount of consensus toward the goal and the change that you're trying to make. Now, you need to allow for strategy and input on strategy from people. It's a good idea to get their input, and some of them will have really good ideas, and they'll improve the process. So you allow for input on strategy, but in the end, the few, the leaders, must choose the strategies that actually will be used. Fourth, leaders crave change more than most people. Leaders love change more than others because they're leaders. And sometimes they become leaders because they like change. And so they're already different from most people at that point. Leaders can always see a better future. Now, I want to talk about this a little bit because when I'm saying that leaders can always see a better future, that does not mean that leaders have to be able to envision, in a sense, the finished product out there, to be able to see the end result, see the picture, have a vision that is crystal clear. A number of years ago, I attended a conference of pastors. There probably were about 500 pastors in the room. And in an evening session, a name that I will not give to you, but you would know if I gave it to you, stood up and told these pastors that you are the visionaries of your church. You have to cast that vision. You have to be the one who lays out the future of the church. And as I'm sitting there in that group, I could feel the air going out of the room. Because the reality is, most of them sitting there already knew they were not visionaries. In the overall population, there really is only about somewhere between 6 and 8% of the general population who are true visionaries, who can look into the future and see a very clear picture of what might be. It's only 6 to 8% of the population. The second strike on that is that most of us who are called to ministry are not hardwired to think that way. We're hardwired to care about people. We're hardwired in many other ways. Very few pastors are true visionaries. So what I'm saying here is not that you have to have that clear endgame vision, but you have to have that sense that there is a better future, some sense about what it might be, and then bring around you the people and enter into a process where if you actually do have a visionary in your church, they can begin to use that gift that God has given them to help in the discussion and to form and to frame with clarity the vision on the other end. Leaders, by definition, help people make changes that improve things. If no change is happening, no improvement in ministry effectiveness and kingdom effectiveness is happening, you're not leading, you're maintaining. Leaders, by definition, help people make changes that improve things. When I became a denominational executive, I knew I had a lot to learn. And there were two of my peers who'd been at it for a good period of time, and who I knew was very effective in the leadership that they were providing in their districts. And so I asked both of them to coach me. And one of the two that I asked to coach me happened to be the executive for New England. I grew up in New England, grew up in Connecticut. He would, from time to time, poke me with a sharp stick, and he would say, "Bill, you know New England is a mission field. You know that, it's just a different culture, different world." He said, "You also know that, you have no credibility in New England if you weren't born in New England. And you were born in New England. You need to come back to New England and work with me." And I would say, I love New England. I love going back. I have family there. I love going to Boston and eating New England seafood, East Coast seafood. Oh, yeah, I love, yeah. But, you know, I have no desire to live in New England anymore. And he'd look at me and he'd say, well, why? And I'd say, you know what? I don't know. I just don't have any desire. I'm on a trip with him. He's coaching me a little bit and showing me how they made decisions about where and if to plant a church in a given community. And we're riding around in the towns in Connecticut. We turn one corner, and there's a L-shaped shopping mall there. And he says, oh, see that mall over there? He said about 3 years ago, it burned to the ground. There was nothing left but, concrete and a few metal pipes sticking up in the air. He said, they built it back exactly the way it was. And I said, that's it. That's why I have no desire to move back to New England. I would have looked at that and said, what a great opportunity we have to change it, to make it bigger, to make it better, to make it more functional for today. No, in New England, they build it back exactly the way it was. And for leaders, we don't want to be building it back the way it was. We want to be leading change that increases the church's effectiveness at raising up spiritually mature and healthy people, and is effective at reaching out, connecting with, and drawing unchurched, unsaved people to faith in Jesus Christ. Number 5, usually only about 10% of the people you lead are opposed to any given change you suggest. Now, I just want to admit that in my experience, most leaders don't believe this. Every time I've said it to a group, there's always some that say, it's not true. Well, I want to challenge you, a little exercise. Think about the last change that you introduced and were talking to, trying to bring about, and write down the names of all the people who oppose that change. And ask yourself then, is this more than 10% of the people? Now, over the years, I've had people get back to me after I've laid that challenge out, and a few of them have said, yes, it was more than 10%. Well, then you ask the question, okay, so how many of these were opinion leaders in your church? And a lot of times the answer, after they reflect on that, is actually there were just 3 of them that were opinion leaders, and all of the rest were the folk who just follow those opinion leaders. Which then talks to us about strategy for bringing about change. Knowing who your opinion leaders are and spending time with them early on in the process. Planting that seed, getting their reaction, listening to their suggestions and their thoughts, and bringing them on into the process will in the end reduce the opposition for every one of them that you can bring on board. You will reduce the opposition significantly. You never, ever want to sacrifice the future of the 90% because of the discontent of the 10%. So you try to gain support from as many of that 10% as you can, but it is seldom right to abandon a change because of the 10%. The 6th principle is that loud does not equal large. Opponents typically speak more often and more loudly than proponents. And oftentimes, opponents are more passionate about something than proponents. And so my word of encouragement to you is don't be bullied by the noise. The 7th principle is most who oppose change do not have a clearly formed vision of a preferred future. That would be my phone ringing on my watch. Now, unless it's what is or what was. They don't know what they want. If they're opposing change, what they want is what is, or sometimes what was. In my denominational leadership, it was Southern California and Arizona. Arizona, of course, has the winter influx of the snowbirds. And they would come in from Michigan and Illinois, and they would be there for sometimes 4 or 5 months. And they became deeply involved and embedded in the life of the church. And talk about conflict. Huge conflict between the snowbirds and the desert rats. The natives to Arizona refer to themselves as the desert rats. And the reason is quite obvious. They're very, very different people from very different cultures. And the problem was that all of the snowbirds came wanting a church just like the church back in Michigan or Illinois in Arizona. And of course, the people who started the church and usually controlled the church were the desert rats. And oh my goodness, talk about a context ready and ripe for conflict. But they wanted what was or what is back home. They did not have a clear vision of a different future. They just know what they don't want. And what they don't want is the idea that you're suggesting. They don't want change. They're the modern-day Israelites who want to go back to Egypt, if you please. And you cannot build a better future from a vision of the past. Now, the past is important. Understanding the past, knowing the past, is very important in change agentry. If you're not aware of what's been, if you aren't understanding the DNA that was implanted in that church from its very founding, if you're ignorant of all of that, it is very likely you will fail at change agentry. But you do not build a vision out of the past. The past informs some of the ideas that you have and some of the changes that you might want to implement. The past influences how you may go about trying to bring that change. But the past is not the vision for the future. This fact increases the importance of a clear, concise, compelling vision. And you're going to hear this again in a couple more slides. And this is one of the reasons why, as Jen and I have talked, we wanted to marry up change agentry with vision alignment, because the two of them really are wedded together, and in change agentry and being effective in advancing kingdom effectiveness for your church, bringing the two things together is key to a high level of effectiveness. Number 8, care for your detractors. Do you have anybody like this in your church? You know, they talk to you and you just see the smoke pouring out their ears. You know. Well, now notice that I said detractors, not enemies. In the lunch session, I talked a little bit about my experience with Purgatory Baptist Church. I affectionately call the second church that I pastored Purgatory Baptist Church. The reason is, before I went there, I did not believe in purgatory, and by the time I knew, I had been in purgatory. 3 out of my 4 predecessors not just left the church, they left ministry, and the church almost got me. You can imagine that in some board meetings, there were some very, very interesting and, shall I say, intense disagreements and conversations. I had a young man come onto my staff. Ultimately, a number of years later, he followed me and had a very successful 12-year run as the lead pastor of the church. But when he first came, he would sit in the board meeting, and he was relatively young in ministry, and it was the first time he'd ever seen intense conflict among leaders in a church. He really was naive, wasn't he? And And then the meeting would be over, and we'd all jump in our cars, and we drove over to the neighboring pie shop, and we sat around tables, and we ate pie, drank coffee, told jokes, and scheduled our next round of golf together. Some years later, he apologized to me and confessed to me that for a significant period of time, he thought I lacked integrity. Because how can you go tooth to tooth, just face to face, nose to nose in a meeting, and then go and sit and have pie and coffee and go golfing with them? He said, I've come to realize you could do that with integrity because you never saw them as the enemy. And that was true. I never did see them as the enemy. So when people oppose your ideas, don't take it personally. I know that's hard. But if you can just remind yourself and kind of take that step back and do your best to disengage from taking it personally. Now, I know it's even harder because sometimes they attack personally. But again, to respond is not going to be productive. To respond in kind is not going to be productive. But to be able to step back and not respond in the way in our humanness we would be inclined to respond. The ninth is that fear of opposition derails more leaders than actual opposition. Fear of opposition is oftentimes more powerful than the actual opposition. And as leaders, to be as successful as leaders, to bring about change, we have to push back our fears. We need to learn to take risks. So you say, how do I do this? How do I learn to be courageous? Well, I have a recommendation for you. It's a book, Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. I've oftentimes said that if a law was passed and you could only have 5 books on your bookshelf, one should be the Bible, and one of the other 4 should be Failure of Nerve. If you're a leader, Failure of Nerve. In it, Friedman talks about the things that hold us back, that keep us from being courageous. He helps us begin to understand our own behavior, our own natural ways of responding. And then what's great about the book is he doesn't just point out what's at work in us, but he actually then begins to lay out some ways in which we can reprogram ourselves and begin to respond and learn how to respond differently. Friedman was a Jewish rabbi, one of the fathers of family systems theory. And because of his faith, he understood, for example, that the health of a family, whether it be a nuclear family or a family in the sense of maybe even a church, that the health of that family was dependent on the leader of that family. And then he talks in the book again about how we can become that kind of leader. Now, I do have one word of warning. The first 2 or 3 chapters is a little heavy on psychology, and you may need to read it 2 or 3 times, but read it 2 or 3 times and get on into the latter part of the book because it will be immensely helpful to you. I've recommended this book countless times, and many, many times I've had pastors who are nearing retirement, some of them very effective pastors, nearing retirement. And when I introduce them to the book, they get back to me and they say, where was this book when I was 24? So I could talk a little bit about it, but better yet, go to Friedman and learn what God has for you there. Now, when you're talking about courage, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the determination to lead in spite of your fears. The 10th thing that I've learned is that the why is more important than the what or the how. The what and the how are important. Hear me. The what and the how are important, but they are inherently divisive. Someone always has a better, cheaper, faster, shorter, easier way of doing what you're proposing. The why, on the other hand, is inherently uniting. The why reminds people of the reason why we are doing what we are doing. So the why brings us back, and here's why it's so effective for us, especially in ministry and in the church. The why brings us back to your God-given purpose, the mission. I believe that every single church is where it is because God had a plan for it. Now, whether or not they have lived into that plan is a whole nother discussion. But every church, I believe, for God's kingdom purposes, it is there because He has a plan for what He wants it to accomplish in that community and in the world. And anytime we are out of sync with what God put the church there to do in the first place, we will be less effective or maybe even ineffective as far as advancing the kingdom is concerned. So we focus on the why because the why unites and it motivates as well. So you start with the why, and you end with the why, and you season the entire conversation and process with the why.
How do you explain when things don't go as we assume? Or better, how do you explain when others are able to achieve things that seem to defy all of the assumptions? For example, why is Apple so innovative? Year after year after year after year, they're more innovative than all their competition. And yet, they're just a computer company. They're just like everyone else. They have the same access to the same talent, the same agencies, the same consultants, the same media. Then why is it that they seem to have something different? Why is it that Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement? He wasn't the only man who suffered in a pre-civil rights America, and he certainly wasn't the only great orator of the day. Why him? And why is it that the Wright brothers were able to figure out controlled powered manned flight when there were certainly other teams who were better qualified, better funded, and they didn't achieve powered manned flight, and the Wright brothers beat them to it? There's something else at play here. About 3.5 years ago, I made a discovery, and this discovery profoundly changed my view on how I thought the world worked, and it even profoundly changed the way in which I operate in it. As it turns out, there's a pattern. As it turns out, all the great and inspiring leaders and organizations in the world, whether it's Apple or Martin Luther King or the Wright brothers, they all think, act, and communicate the exact same way, and it's the complete opposite to everyone else. All I did was codify it. And it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. Why, how, what? This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Let me define the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? And why should anyone care? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because they're easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done, that's how most sales is done, and that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do, we say how we're different or how we're better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers with the biggest clients. We have, we always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from me. All I did was reverse the order of the information. What it proves to us is that people don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. This explains why every single person in this room is perfectly comfortable buying a computer from Apple. But we're also perfectly comfortable buying an MP3 player from Apple, or a phone from Apple, or a DVR from Apple. But as I said before, Apple's just a computer company. There's nothing that distinguishes them structurally from any of their competitors. Their competitors are all equally qualified to make all of these products. In fact, they tried. A few years ago, Gateway came out with flat-screen TVs. They're eminently qualified to make flat-screen TVs. They've been making flat-screen monitors for years. Nobody bought one. And Dell came out with MP3 players and PDAs. And they make great quality products, and they can make perfectly well-designed products, and nobody bought one. In fact, talking about it now, we can't even imagine buying an MP3 player from Dell. Why would you buy an MP3 player from a computer company? But we do it every day. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. The goal is not to do business with everybody who needs what you have. The goal is to do business with people who believe what you believe. Here's the best part. None of what I'm telling you is my opinion. It's all grounded in the tenets of biology, not psychology, biology. If you look at a cross-section of the human brain, looking from the top down, what you see is the human brain is actually broken into 3 major components that correlate perfectly with the golden circle. Our newest brain, our Homo sapien brain, our neocortex, corresponds with the what level. The neocortex is responsible for all of our rational and analytical thought and language. The middle 2 sections make up our limbic brains, and our limbic brains are responsible for all of our feelings, like trust and loyalty. It's also responsible for all human behavior, all decision-making, and it has no capacity for language. In other words, when we communicate from the outside in, yes, people can understand vast amounts of complicated information like features and benefits and facts and figures. It just doesn't drive behavior. When we communicate from the inside out, we're talking directly to the part of the brain that controls behavior, and then we allow people to rationalize it with the tangible things we say and do. This is where gut decisions come from. Sometimes you can give somebody all the facts and your figures, and they say, I know what all the facts and details say, but it just doesn't feel right. Why would we use that verb? It doesn't feel right, because the part of the brain that controls decision-making doesn't control language. And the best we can muster up is, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Or sometimes you say you're leading with your heart, or you're leading with your soul. Well, I hate to break it to you, those aren't other body parts controlling your behavior. It's all happening here in your limbic brain, the part of the brain that controls decision-making and not language. But if you don't know why you do what you do, and people respond to why you do what you do, then how will you ever get people to vote for you or buy something from you, or more importantly, be loyal and want to be a part of what it is that you do?
You can tell it's an old video, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen it already. And if you haven't, going on YouTube and looking at the whole thing can be beneficial. He goes on to talk about the Wright brothers and why he raised them as an issue, or as an example. And the Wright brothers had this passion for building a flying machine. And they were the unlikely ones to create the first one that actually worked, because there actually was another man whose name I've forgotten and nobody knows, who was incredibly well-funded, was connected with academia and had the best minds that worked with him. He paid lots of money to the people to be part of the process of trying to figure out how to make a machine fly. The Wright brothers had none of those things. Believe it or not, they built the first plane that flew with the profits of their bicycle shop. Can you imagine how lucrative that was? But they succeeded because they had a vision, they had a why. They believed, the Wright brothers, they believed that if a flying machine could actually become a reality, it would change the world. And they wanted to be part of changing the world. And the people who worked with them to help them achieve that weren't getting paid, but they believed in the cause. They believed in what it was. They believed in changing the world by creating a machine that would fly. He points out that the evidence of the difference between them is that the very next day, after the news of the Wright brothers' flight hit, the unnamed man, unknown man, and his whole team quit. Because for them, it was just about making money. It was a purpose, a means to an end, rather than a why, a vision, a purpose. And then he asked the question about why Martin Luther King. The reality is there were a lot of very, very gifted orators around. He wasn't the only one. But where Martin Luther King stood out was that he believed there were two laws. He believed there is laws that are men's laws, and he believed that there are laws that are God's laws. And he believed that if man's laws did not mirror God's laws, they were wrong, and they should not be. And so it comes that famous day on the Mall in Washington, D.C., no publicity, internet wasn't around, cell phones weren't around, there was no publicity, formal publicity about it. There was word of mouth from person to person, and 250,000 people showed up at the right time, in the right place, and stood in the hot summer sun in Washington. And the civil rights movement gained momentum incredibly from that. And how did that happen? Nobody was getting paid for it. All of these people who came simply came because they wanted to be part of righting a wrong. And when they heard that message from Dr. King, that ignited the movement. And so this idea of starting with the why, starting with, as pastors, as churches, why has God put us here? And what is it that he wants us to do for the kingdom's sake? The 11th lesson is that unimplemented change becomes regret. If you don't muster the courage, take the risk, and implement change, you will almost certainly regret it. The day will come and you will say, if I only had. You'll look back and you'll yearn for what might have been. The 12th change is that incremental change brings, the next insight is that incremental change brings little or no change. There's three kinds of change. There's incremental change, there's transitional change, and there's transformational change. Most of the time, what we go after, believe it or not, is incremental change. That's just kind of improving on what is. And the reality is there's a high price for making even a small change, just improving on it. Transitional change, you're actually replacing something. But you're just replacing something that's not working, a program, a ministry that's not producing any spiritual results at all, and nobody's coming anymore, they're not supporting it. Replacing that with something else, that's transitional change, and it's important to do transitional change in churches. But the most effective kind of change is transformational change, where we actually reinvent, where we create a whole new thing. Now, we could talk a little bit more about these, but here's the thing. Some will always want to make less of a change, to take less of a risk, to play it safe, to protect against failure. Anytime, for any of these three kinds of changes, you're going to have that kind of opposition or that kind of perspective that we shouldn't quite do what we could do. Leaders are almost always tempted to reduce the vision to the faith of the least faith-filled in the church. And when we do that again, we pay a price. No one is inspired by incremental change. And the price of incremental change is almost as high as the price of making transformational change. And so my encouragement to you is that when change is needed, don't go small. When change is needed, ask God, what is the most significant change that you can use to accomplish your purposes? And go big, not small. The 13th is that the greatest enemy of your future success is your current success. Success tends to make leaders conservative. Don't mess with success. And success tempts us to do nothing until decline forces us to re-examine everything. So keep changing, keep seeking a better way, keep experimenting, keep risking. Make change the norm. See, stop and think about that. If in the culture of your church, people get to the place where they understand and they actually know that we're going to just be changing all the time. We're not going to sit still. There are always ways in which we can better serve the Lord. There's always ways in which we can be more effective. And so constantly making change. Pastor Leith Anderson, pastor of a megachurch in Minnesota, he was a pastor at a church for 27 years. One of the interesting things was he had a capital campaign going for 27 straight years. As soon as they finished one, there was another. Because they had already a vision of something else, something different, something more, something better that they could do that cost money. And the people responded campaign after campaign after campaign because the why of it was so clear. Make change the norm. Well, I'm going to come down here in case you do have a question or two.